What you're about to witness isn't just a story. It's proof that miracles still happen in the most unexpected ways. When faith meets innocence, when silence meets song, the impossible becomes reality. This is the moment that made an entire congregation fall to their knees. Before we continue, leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I really want to see how far these powerful stories are reaching. The morning sun cast long shadows through the stained glass windows of St. Catherine's Church in Millbrook, Tennessee, painting rainbow patterns across the worn wooden pews where 6-year-old Isabella Martinez sat perfectly still, her dark eyes fixed on the statue of the Virgin Mary that stood in the alcove near the altar. Her small hands moved in practiced gestures, signing to her mother Elena, who sat beside her, tears streaming down her weathered face as she signed back that yes, God could hear Isabella's prayers even if Isabella couldn't hear his voice. The child had been born in complete silence, a world where birds sang songs she'd never know, where her mother's lullabies existed only as vibrations against her chest when Elena held her close at night. The doctors had tried everything: hearing aids, experimental treatments, consultations with specialists from Nashville to New York, but Isabella's auditory nerves had never developed properly, leaving her trapped in a soundless world that others couldn't truly understand. Elena worked 3 jobs to pay for medical bills that continued to pile up despite the lack of progress: cleaning offices at night, stocking shelves at the grocery store before dawn, and taking in sewing work whenever she could find a spare moment. Their small apartment above the hardware store downtown was sparse but clean, decorated with Isabella's drawings of angels and flowers, images of beauty that existed beyond the realm of sound. The other children at school had been cruel at first, mimicking Isabella's sign language with mocking gestures, laughing when she couldn't hear the teacher calling her name, pushing her on the playground because they knew she couldn't hear them coming up behind her. But Isabella never cried, at least not where anyone could see her, saving her tears for the darkness of her bedroom where she'd bury her face in her pillow and wonder why God had made her different, why he had given everyone else something so precious, while leaving her with nothing but silence. Father Michael had been the first person outside her family to learn sign language specifically for Isabella, spending months studying online videos and practicing with Elena until he could communicate directly with the child who attended Mass every Sunday without fail. He'd noticed how she always sat in the same spot, third pew from front on the left side, where she had the best view of the Virgin Mary statue that had been donated to the church 50 years ago by a wealthy benefactor whose own daughter had been miraculously healed of polio. The statue was beautiful, carved from white marble with such skill that Mary's face seemed to radiate compassion, her arms outstretched as if ready to embrace anyone who approached. Isabella would stare at it throughout the entire service, her lips moving in silent prayer, her hands occasionally lifting to sign words that only she and God knew. The other parishioners had grown accustomed to Isabella's presence, some learning basic signs to greet her, others simply offering warm smiles and gentle pats on the shoulder. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the church's Sunday school, had created special visual lessons just for Isabella, using colorful pictures and animated gestures to tell Bible stories that transcended the need for sound. Mr. Thompson, the church's elderly organist, would sometimes let Isabella place her hands on the organ while he played, allowing her to feel the vibrations of hymns she'd never hear. But despite these kindnesses, Isabella remained isolated in ways that went deeper than her deafness, carrying a loneliness that seemed too heavy for such small shoulders. It was on a particularly difficult Thursday evening in October when everything changed. Elena had just received another rejection letter from an insurance company, denying coverage for a new experimental surgery that doctors in Boston claimed might restore partial hearing. She brought Isabella to the church because she didn't know where else to go, needing the peace of the sanctuary while she figured out how to tell her daughter that once again, hope had been snatched away. The church was empty except for them, the setting sun casting the space in golden light that made the dust motes dance like tiny angels in the air. Isabella had walked straight to her usual spot, kneeling before the Virgin Mary statue with her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles turned white. Elena watched from a few pews back as her daughter signed her prayers, the same question she asked every night. Why couldn't she hear her mother's voice? Why couldn't she sing songs like other children? Why did God make her broken? The word broken always shattered Elena's heart because she knew that's how Isabella saw herself, not as differently abled or special, but as fundamentally flawed, missing a piece that everyone else had. She was about to go comfort her daughter when Isabella suddenly went rigid, her hands freezing mid-sign, her eyes growing impossibly wide as she stared at the statue. The air in the church seemed to shift, becoming thicker, charged with something Elena couldn't name. The temperature dropped noticeably, their breath becoming visible in small puffs despite the October evening being relatively mild. Isabella's mouth fell open, and for the first time in her life, she turned her head as if following a sound, her eyes tracking something invisible moving through the air around her. Elena stood, her heart pounding, calling out Isabella, but her daughter didn't respond. Not because she couldn't hear her mother's voice, but because she seemed transfixed by something else entirely. Then Isabella began to cry, not the silent tears she usually shed, but sobbing with intensity that shook her entire small frame. She pressed her hands against her ears that had never functioned, that had never sent a single signal to her brain, and her mouth moved, forming a single word that Elena could read on her lips, singing. The mother rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside her daughter, signing frantically, asking what was wrong, what was happening, but Isabella just kept pressing her hands to her ears, tears streaming down her face as she turned back to look at the statue. Father Michael, who had been in his office preparing Sunday's sermon, heard the commotion and came running. He found Elena holding Isabella, both of them crying, the child still pressing her palms against her ears as if trying to block out something overwhelming. When he signed to Isabella, asking what was happening, she responded with shaking hands, signing words that made no sense. Mary, singing beautiful hurts, too much beauty. He looked at the statue, which appeared exactly as it always had, serene and still, carved marble that couldn't possibly produce sound. But Isabella insisted, her signs becoming more frantic. She said the statue was glowing, though neither Elena nor Father Michael could see any light emanating from it. She said Mary's lips were moving, though the carved mouth remained frozen in its gentle smile. Most impossibly, she claimed she could hear. Not with her ears, she signed, but with something inside her chest, inside her bones, inside her soul. The song, she said, was like nothing from this world, notes that didn't exist on any instrument, harmonies that made her feel like her heart might burst from joy and sorrow combined. Father Michael called Dr. Sarachon, a parishioner who worked at the local hospital. She arrived within minutes with basic medical equipment, checking Isabella's vital signs, shining lights in her eyes, looking for any sign of seizure or hallucination. But the child's responses were normal, even as she continued to insist that she could hear Mary singing, that the song was telling her stories about heaven, about love, about how God had been listening to every silent prayer she'd ever prayed. Dr. Chin pulled Elena aside, suggesting they take Isabella to the emergency room for a full neurological workup, concerned that something might be happening in her brain. But Isabella refused to leave, clinging to the pew with surprising strength for such a small child. She signed that the song wasn't finished, that Mary had more to tell her. She described colors she'd never seen before, said they were woven into the music like threads in a tapestry. She talked about feeling her grandmother's presence, though Elena's mother had died when Isabella was just 2 years old. The child said her grandmother was standing beside Mary, that she was singing too, that she was saying Isabella would be okay, that everything had a purpose, even the silence. Word spread quickly through the small town. Within an hour, the church had filled with curious onlookers, some skeptical, others hopeful, all watching the small deaf girl who knelt transfixed before the statue. Isabella seemed oblivious to the crowd, her entire focus on something only she could perceive. She'd occasionally signed to her mother, describing what she was experiencing. Warmth like summer sunshine, peace like floating in calm water, love like nothing she'd ever felt before. She said the Virgin Mary was showing her things, not in pictures, but an understanding that went straight into her mind. Then, at exactly 8:47 p.m., Isabella stood up. She turned to face the crowd, and when she opened her mouth, she spoke. Not in sign language, not in gestures, but in a clear, perfect voice that she had never used before, had never been able to use because she'd never heard speech to learn it. She says to have faith, Isabella said, her words causing gasps throughout the church. She says God hears everything, even silence. She says miracles aren't always about fixing what's broken, but about finding beauty in what is. Elena collapsed, overwhelmed by hearing her daughter's voice for the first time. Father Michael stood frozen, his theological training offering no explanation for what he was witnessing. Dr. Chin was already on her phone, calling colleagues, trying to make medical sense of something that defied every principle she'd studied. But Isabella continued speaking, her voice growing stronger, more confident. She said Mary had shown her that her deafness wasn't a punishment or a mistake, but a gift that had taught her to listen with more than her ears, to communicate with more than words, to understand that God's voice came in many forms. The crowd began to pray, some falling to their knees, others reaching out toward Isabella, as if she might transmit some of the grace she was experiencing. She walked among them, still speaking, telling them things that only they could know. Mrs. Patterson's secret fear about her cancer returning, Mr. Joaquin's guilt over his estranged son, teenager Amy Chen struggled with depression that she'd hidden from everyone. Isabella couldn't have known these things, yet she spoke to each person with a wisdom that seemed impossible for a 6-year-old child. When she reached a young boy named Marcus who was in a wheelchair, paralyzed from a car accident the year before, Isabella stopped. She signed something to him. Marcus had learned sign language from YouTube videos to communicate with Isabella at school. His eyes widened and he began to cry. Later, he would tell his parents that Isabella had signed. Mary says you'll dance at your wedding. Nobody understood what that meant then, but 3 years later, when experimental spinal surgery partially restored his mobility, Marcus would take his first steps at physical therapy while thinking of Isabella's words. As suddenly as it had begun, it ended. Isabella blinked, swayed slightly, and Elena caught her before she could fall. The child looked confused, disoriented, her hands moving to sign. What happened? Why is everyone here? She couldn't remember speaking, couldn't remember the words she'd said. When people tried to talk to her, she couldn't hear them. Her deafness had returned, if it had ever truly left. But something had changed. The sadness that had always lingered in Isabella's eyes was gone, replaced by a peace that seemed to glow from within. Dr. Chin insisted on taking Isabella to the hospital for tests. Brain scans, hearing tests, psychological evaluations. Everything came back exactly as it had always been. Isabella was profoundly deaf, had been since birth, would likely always be. There was no medical explanation for how she had spoken, how she had known things she couldn't have known, how she had formed perfect words without ever having heard them. The only evidence that anything had happened at all was the testimony of 43 witnesses and several phone recordings that captured Isabella's voice speaking clearly about things beyond her knowledge. The church investigated, as churches do with potential miracles. Experts were brought in, skeptics and believers alike. The statue was examined, x-rayed, tested for any kind of device or explanation. They found nothing but solid marble, carved by human hands 50 years ago. Some claimed mass hysteria. Others suggested an elaborate hoax. But nobody could explain how a deaf child who had never spoken had suddenly produced perfect speech, or how she had known the secret struggles of people she'd barely met. Isabella herself seemed untroubled by the controversy. She continued attending Mass every Sunday, sitting in her usual spot, signing her prayers to the Virgin Mary statue. But now her prayers were different. Instead of asking why she was broken, she thanked God for making her exactly as she was. She started teaching sign language classes at the church, helping hearing people understand that communication was about more than sound. She became a bridge between two worlds, showing others that silence could be its own kind of music. Elena found peace too, no longer desperately seeking a cure for something that Isabella no longer saw as needing to be fixed. The medical bills were mysteriously paid by anonymous donors who had been in the church that night. The family moved to a better apartment, one with large windows that let in plenty of light for Isabella to draw by. The girl's art changed after that night. Where she once drew angels and flowers, she now painted abstract swirls of color that she said represented the songs she felt rather than heard. Years passed. Isabella grew from a quiet, isolated child into a confident young woman who attended Gallaudet University, became a teacher, and eventually wrote a book about finding God in silence. She never heard another sound in the traditional sense, but she claimed she could still sometimes feel that celestial music, especially when she prayed. She married a hearing man who learned sign language to court her, and at their wedding, when they shared their first dance as husband and wife, Marcus, the boy from the wheelchair who had indeed learned to walk again, served as their best man. The statue of the Virgin Mary still stands in St. Catherine's Church. Pilgrims come from around the world to see it, to pray before it, hoping for their own miracles. Some claim to feel something, a presence, a warmth, a sense of being heard. Others feel nothing at all. But Isabella, who still visits whenever she's in town, always signs the same thing to those who ask about that night. The miracle wasn't that I heard Mary sing. The miracle was learning that I've been singing to her all along, in a language beyond sound. Father Michael, now elderly, still tells a story to anyone who will listen. He says it taught him that God's miracles aren't always about changing our circumstances, but about changing our understanding of them. He learned sign language fluently after that night and conducted special services for the deaf community that grew around the church. He often quotes Isabella's book. We spend so much time asking God to fix us that we forget to ask Him to show us we were never broken. The truth of what happened that October night remains a mystery. Medical science offers no explanation. The church never officially declared it a miracle, though they didn't deny it either. The witnesses maintained their stories despite years of scrutiny. But perhaps the real miracle wasn't in the inexplicable event itself, but in how it transformed the community, teaching them that different doesn't mean less than, that silence doesn't mean absence, and that sometimes the greatest songs are the ones only the heart can hear. Isabella never sought fame from her experience, turning down movie deals and interview requests, preferring to live quietly, teaching deaf children that they are perfect exactly as they are. She still signs when she prays, her hands moving in that beautiful language that needs no sound, and sometimes, just sometimes, she swears she can still feel that otherworldly music resonating in her bones, reminding her that God hears everything, especially the prayers we cannot speak aloud. Watch the next video on your screen to witness another incredible story of faith that will leave you speechless.